Now that we have a rigged character, we'll look at creating an animation by moving and manipulating these controllers over time. Now we can see that we have a controller that's been created at each of kind of the main appendages. Both of the arms have a controller, both of the legs have a controller, and if we change the position of those controllers, we can see that the limb itself always changes. There's a little bit of a problem with that leg there. We'll look at it in a moment. We also have a shoulder controller that lets us kind of control the lean forward and back, pivoting around the hips. We have a head controller that if you click and drag right now won't really do anything. We'll maybe see later on how we could use this controller. We also have two for the hips. We have a larger controller called C hips and a smaller controller called CC hips. And if we move C hips, the larger one, we can see that the whole body moves as one. If we were to select the smaller controller, we'll see that this controller moves on its own, independent of the others, and it lets us kind of create this like hip rotation forward or backwards. Now, for this assignment, actually, working with this controller can cause some problems as it does change the relationship of where the arms and the legs connect to the body. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to put it back in place. And I'm going to suggest that for this project, I'm actually going to hide CC hips. So I'm going to look at my layers palette and I'm going to toggle the eye so it goes away. And I'm also going to click the shy switch so that it's not visible anymore. This will allow us to simplify the context of this problem and have a little bit more success. Now, before we start animating anything, we should move our character to an initial pose. And we can do that by manipulating the position of these controllers. I'm going to take my timeline, slide it to time 0, and then starting with the hips, let's get our character in a seated position. Now, as I do this, you may note that the legs are bending kind of in opposite directions. The left foot is bending maybe in the way we'd expect, and the right foot is bending the opposite way. Now, the rig doesn't know which way the feet are pointing. It just knows that each limb needs to have a bend for that joint. Now, we can set up some of the properties for these controllers by looking at the effects controls. Now, I've got them pulled up here already, but you can find them under Window, Effects Controls. When one of the controllers has been selected, the name of the controller will show up in the Windows palette here. So we've got controller for the right foot is active. And if I look in the Effects Controls palette on the left-hand side, the first thing is talking about the rotation of the bend. And if I check this clockwise box, we'll see that it switches the bend in the knee. And now I've got something that looks a lot more normal for someone who's trying to adopt a seated position. I'll grab the other controller here and put that in a similar pose. Now it's already looking like he's sitting in the chair a little bit better. And I'm going to take his hand controllers. I'll take CL hand, going to put it at his side, and I'll take his right hand. I'll just also put it at his side. Right, and if we were to toggle the visibility of those controllers just to look at our character briefly without them being in the way, we can see that that looks pretty good for a starting pose. Let's turn them back on though, because we'll need them for working. Now, if I want to keyframe the position or the rotation of these controllers over time, we need to select the appropriate controller and then open up that keyframe attribute. I'm going to start with hips. If this character's on the bus and the bus is moving, we want to have some kind of idle animation, maybe where the character's leaning forward and back just a little bit with the motion of the bus. So to do that, let's hit the R key, which is going to pull up the rotation property. Right, and if we were to just play around with rotation, we can see that we can have our character rotate forward and back, and just by using this property on the hips controller. Now I'm going to set it to 0 for a moment, and let's turn on the stopwatch icon to say that we're going to animate this property over time. So at time 0, we'll click the stopwatch and it automatically creates a keyframe, and let's say we want a value of -3. We'll hit enter. Now if we move our time forward to 1 second, if I change this property, like let's say I click on it and type +3 for instance and hit enter, we'll see that our position of the character is updated, and also that a new keyframe has been implicitly added. Right? The whole idea of this stopwatch being active says that this property can change over time. So if we're at a time that has no keyframe, and I give it a new value, After Effects knows, oh, you must want a new keyframe here. So it's a very quick way to add a keyframe. We can always click manually add keyframe. This is the add or remove keyframe at current time. If I click on that, I could type -3 again. And then if I went to time equals 3, I could say, let's create a new keyframe, +3, hit enter. And now we have a little bit of a subtle animation of kind of rocking back and forth with the motion of the bus. Now our animation is going to last a little bit longer than 3 seconds. So I could carry on at every second, adding the next keyframe. But this is a pattern, right? -3, +3, -3, +3. So I could also drag a box over my 4 keyframes, press Ctrl+C to copy, and press Ctrl+V to paste it where the timeline is. So if I move the timeline to my next second marker, 4 seconds, and press Ctrl+V, it'll drop those keyframes in again, and this will get me up to 7 seconds, which is probably going to be just about right for our animation. Right? We can go to the start and hit the spacebar to see how that looks. It may run slow the first time or two because it tries to render it at the same time that it plays it back. We can see that we've made a pretty simple starting animation. Now that we're done with hips, I can either close the properties just by clicking the arrow to the left of the layer name, or I can just type R again to hide the rotation property. Now, with our character leaning forward and leaning back, let's start another animation of a different controller at 1 second. I'd like to pick the left hand of the character and press P for position. Most of the time we can just move where the controller is, and it's going to allow us to animate that limb or appendage just by putting it in a new spot. So let's say at time 1 we're going to start our animation. So the very first keyframe should be here. So I'll turn on the stopwatch and I get my first keyframe automatically. And let's say in 15 frames he's going to lift his hand up to the top of his head. He's going to scratch his head or something like that. So I could change the values in the property palette down here in the layers palette, or I could simply grab with the move tool, the selection tool active, and bring his hand up to where his head goes. Right? And if I scrub between those, we can see that he moves his hand straight up to the top of his head. And quite literally straight up to the top of his head. If we look at this path, we can see the amount of distance that each keyframe will move the controller. And we can also see that it's moving in a straight path. Now it is possible with the Bezier handle to change the path from being a straight line to being some sort of arc, and we have a handle kind of on both sides. I might actually take this top handle and make it quite short, which will let my next action be a sharp change in direction, but use this bottom handle to make a curved path along which the controller can follow. And that's just going to allow me to refine the motion of this hand a little bit based on rather than using that linear point-to-point direction that After Effects automatically put in. Now to complete this scratching the head animation, I'll go forward a few frames and grab the controller and move it down. Now you can see that because I add that Bezier handle, this next direction, it doesn't want to go in a straight line, it wants to follow a path. So I'm going to have to take this handle and say, actually for this one, let's just move in a straight line, a sharp change in direction. So we can see that when the hand gets up to the top of the head, then it's going to go straight down for a few frames. And then a few frames later, let's move it straight back up. And then a few frames later, we'll move it straight back down, just mimicking scratching a head a few times. And then maybe back up to the top. And then we'll give a little bit more time, similar to our first amount of time, to bring the hand back down to a resting position. And again, we can see this time it's choosing a straight path, and we'll just leave it there for comparison. We can see which one we like better. And as we play through this, I'll just shorten the work area to just play that section of animation. We can see that he scratches his head a couple times, and then drops his hand back down to his side. And it looks pretty good. Alright, I'll lengthen my work area again, and we'll move on to the next thing. We can take our left-hand controller and type P to close the position attribute, and then we can look at our other hand, our right hand. Now, after scratching our head, we'll maybe say that our bean office worker has decided that maybe it's time to get off the bus, and so he wants to lift his hand up and grab that yellow cord to indicate he wants to get off at the next stop. So maybe we'll start close to 3:15 or maybe just before there. Let's open the position attribute and say I'm going to start a keyframe for this controller here, and I'll take about 15 frames or so for this character's hand, which we can't see the controller, so let's turn it on. And with this controller, we'll move the hand up to reach all the way up and grab the cord. We can see here that we're actually making use of the auto stretch, which works well, so that we don't have to worry about our character having the perfect length of hand to reach the cord, and it also gives us that sense of exaggeration. And actually want the character to not pull the cord right away. We're going to incorporate some secondary action where we can direct the audience's attention by something else that the character does. So as the character lifts his hand up to the cord before pulling it, we'll also have the character look up at the cord to direct our attention there, and then the action will occur. So we need a little bit of time with the hand on the cord before we pull it down. And a way that we can have sort of nothing happen is to have two identical keyframes separated by time. If there's no change in the properties, the visual representation will stay the same. So this keyframe is basically representing his hand being on the cord. So if we were to take this keyframe, copy it, and move forward 10 or 15 frames and press Ctrl V to paste, since both of these keyframes are the same thing, during that time nothing will happen to the position of the hand controller. Once that's done, then we can change the hand controller so that we're pulling this cord down, and then we're going to return the cord back to where it came from, and then we'll bring the hand back to its resting position. I'll shorten the work area here so we can just preview the animation that we have so far. We can see that there's a little bit of time that we'll be able to direct the gaze of the worker up to see what's going on with the hand as he pulls the cord and returns the hand down to his side. Now to do that gaze, we simply need to switch controllers. Let's activate the visibility of the shoulder controller and type R for rotation. Now if you just try changing the rotation of the shoulder controller, you'll see that this gives us some deform controls that allow us to change the direction of the gaze of the character. Now if we do too much, we'll see that the rig starts to break, where maybe he's wrapping in on himself, or the arm is extending beyond the body, or maybe the arm is coming out of his hair. So we have to be careful about how much we're going to change these properties, but we can change them a little bit to still give that sense of looking up or looking down. So we should think about where we're going to start this animation. As his hand is going up, his gaze should follow. So let's set a keyframe of that neutral position. So I'll turn on my animation kind of as the hand is just about to start moving up. And then as the hand is moving up, let's change this property to maybe -25 or so. Just kind of shows his head tilting up with the hand. That's a good secondary action. And then we want the gaze to stay there until the hand starts going down. So again, we'll duplicate this keyframe and we'll look forward until that moment that it's going to start coming back down, which would be after he's pulled the cord. And then as it returns down, then we can change our value back to 0. That'll create us a keyframe again implicitly, and his gaze will be back to the neutral position as the hand returns down. So we can again play these two things together. It'll take a little bit of time this first time to render it. We can see it's not playing this at real time, It's playing at a very disappointing 6 frames per second. But now as we play it back, we can see that his head tips up with that motion of his hand to give us a little bit of secondary action. Now the last thing that's remaining is to actually animate the cord so that it moves with his hand. Now right now the cord, if we unlock the cord layer, is on its own layer. It's independent from the background. And this is essential for any sort of scene elements that are going to be interacted with, right? So an object that the character will pick up or maybe move around has to be on its own layer so it can move independent of the background. Now we've seen that using puppet pins are one way that we can create deformations in the mesh very easily. And the Duik controls allow us to create bones, which make it even a little bit cleaner. So if I were to select this cord layer and grab the puppet pin tool, I'll create one on the end of the mesh, and I'll maybe turn on the mesh here so we can see what's going on. I'll create a second one pretty close to where our character is picking up his grip on the cord, and then one on the other end. Now, if we were to bring our Duik controls back up, I've got mine off, so I'll bring my Duik panel in over here, and on the cord layer, I'm going to open mesh 1, open deform, select my 3 puppet pins, press the bones button, and then I can close Duik at this point. And that's created 3 layers, and each of these bones can be interacted with to deform the mesh. If I grab the selection tool, you can see that I can change the deformation of this layer just by manipulating the position of this bone, kind of like a controller. We don't need to rig it any further than this because it's not a body part of a larger organism, but it's simply just one layer that we're deforming on its own. So if we pick that correct middle bone and hit P for position, if we find that first frame where our character is going to be pulling down on the cord, which for me is about 4:15, I'm going to create a keyframe to see at 4:15 I want the cord to be up here. Next, the next most important part for me is at the bottom of the pull, which is just before 5 seconds. At this point I want the cord to be down where the hand is, so I'll move my time slider to the right time and grab the bone and pull it down so that it's in line with the hand. We can see now that they're going to match with each other, right? It's going to follow that path. And then we'll do the opposite again as the hand returns back up to the top. I'll move forward a number of frames, reposition the bone so that it traces the path with the hand. And then if I were to maybe hide that bone so we can see more clearly what's going on, we can see that it's going to look like the character's interacting with the scene. If we extend our work area and hit run, we should be able to see the whole thing in action. Now the first playthrough is going to be a little bit slower as you can see that it's rendering it at the same time. But then the second playthrough should be considerably better. And maybe to get a final preview, we could disable all of the visibility of our controllers. And there we have it. We've got our full animation. It's created just by manipulating the position and rotation of those controllers.